The cold had turned her into something no longer recognizable as human. On that December morning in 1980, when Wally Nelson stepped onto his front porch with the first light breaking across the frozen Minnesota prairie, he saw what looked like a fallen log covered in frost, 15 feet from his door. The shape was too still, too rigid, bent at angles that didn't belong to the living. Her cowboy boots jutted skyward, her body locked in a terrible arc of reaching as if she'd been trying to crawl those final impossible feet to warmth. When he knelt beside her, the cold rising from her body seemed to pull the breath from his lungs. And he knew with a certainty that carved through his chest, this was Jean Hilliard, and she was dead. But then he saw it. Tiny bubbles, impossibly small, forming at her nostrils and breaking in the Arctic air. Each one, a whisper of life that should not have been there. A defiance against every law of nature and medicine. Her eyes were open, frozen wide in a stare that saw nothing, their surface glazed with ice that caught the pale dawn light. Wally's hands trembled as he reached for her collar. And when his fingers touched her jacket, it felt like gripping frozen steel. He pulled, and her body moved in one solid piece across the snow, stiff as timber, leaving a groove in the frost where warmth and flexibility had once lived. The thermometer on his porch read 22 degrees below zero. The wind had stopped hours ago, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had frozen solid. Inside his house, the clock on the wall read just past 7 in the morning, which meant Jean had been lying there in the killing cold for at least 6 hours, maybe more. Every instinct told him she was beyond saving, that whatever spark had created those tiny bubbles would flicker out before he could even get her to his truck. But Wally Nelson had spent his life on these northern plains, where men learned early that giving up was not something you did while breath still moved in a body, even breath that came in fragments so small they barely disturbed the frost. He lifted her diagonal into the back of his vehicle, unable to bend her frozen limbs, and drove faster than he'd ever driven on those icy roads toward Foston Hospital. 10 minutes away, but feeling like eternity itself stretched thin. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Jean Hilliard had been 19 years old when that night began. She'd grown up in Lengby, Minnesota, a town so small you could walk from one end to the other in the time it took to finish a cup of coffee, where everybody knew your name and your family's history back 3 generations. She was the kind of young woman the town watched grow up with pride, hardworking, sensible, with a smile that could warm a room even on the coldest January morning. Her father had taught her to drive on these rural roads when she was barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel, teaching her to respect the prairie winters that could turn deadly in the space between heartbeats. She worked at the local turkey processing plant during the day and spent her evenings with friends. Ordinary pleasures in an ordinary life. The kind of existence where nothing remarkable was supposed to happen. On December 20th, she'd driven to Foston to spend time with friends at the American Legion, the social heart of young people in that part of Minnesota where entertainment meant making your own warmth against the endless cold. The Ford Limited she drove belonged to her father, a rear-wheel drive beast with no anti-lock brakes. The kind of car that demanded respect when snow and ice claimed the roads. She'd laughed with her friends, felt the comfortable rhythm of small-town Saturday nights, and left around midnight to head home to her parents' house in Lengby. Just a few miles down country roads she could have driven blind. The temperature had been dropping all evening. But Jean was Minnesota-born, and raised cold was just another fact of life, like sunrise or the prairie wind. She wore a jacket and her favorite cowboy boots, dressed for a quick drive home. Not for the trial that was about to test the very limits of what a human body could endure. The road stretched dark and empty. Ahead of her headlights, a ribbon of ice cutting through farmland that rolled away into darkness on both sides. She knew every curve, every rise and fall of this route, had traveled it hundreds of times since she first started driving. Her breath fogged the windshield, and she wiped it with her sleeve, watching the faint lights of distant farmhouses blink through the night like lonely stars. The heater in the Ford struggled against the cold, seeping through every gap in the doors and windows. A losing battle that left frost creeping across the inside of the glass. She thought about her warm bed waiting at home, about sleeping late the next morning, about the ordinary comfort of her mother's kitchen and coffee in the morning light. These small thoughts, these ordinary anticipations of an ordinary life continuing its ordinary course, were the last normal moments Jean Hilliard would know for a very long time. Then the ice betrayed her. On a curve just south of Langby, where the road dipped and turned past frozen fields, the rear wheels of the Ford found a patch of black ice invisible in the darkness. The car slipped sideways with a sickening slide that seemed to happen in slow motion and lightning fast all at once. The steering wheel useless in her hands as physics took control. She felt the stomach-dropping moment when the tires left the road completely, and then the jarring impact as the car plunged into the ditch, tilting at an angle that told her immediately she wasn't driving out of this. The engine died, leaving her in sudden, terrible silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and her own breathing, loud and fast with the shock of the crash. She sat there for a moment, taking inventory. She wasn't hurt. The car was intact. She was just stuck in a ditch in the middle of a frozen night with the temperature dropping like a stone in dark water. The darkness beyond her windows was absolute. The kind of winter night darkness that swallows light and gives nothing back. She tried the engine again, but the Ford only coughed and died. And she knew with sinking certainty that she was going nowhere in this vehicle. She could wait for help, but who would come down this empty road at this hour, in this cold? Or she could walk to Wally Nelson's place. He was a friend of her boyfriend Paul, a cattle rancher whose house she'd been to before. She thought it was maybe 2 miles, maybe a little less. An easy walk on a summer evening, but something different entirely on a night when the cold had teeth. Still, 2 miles was 2 miles, and sitting here wouldn't change that. She opened the door, and the cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. She stepped out onto the road, and the wind that had been still began to pick up, cutting through her jacket as if it were made of paper. Each step away from the car felt like walking into a wall of cold that grew thicker and harder to push through. The cowboy boots, that had seemed like such a good idea that morning, offered no insulation. No protection against the ice working its way through the leather and into her bones. Her breath came out in clouds that froze in the air before dissipating, each exhalation taking precious heat away from her body. She kept her arms wrapped around herself, her hands shoved deep in her pockets, trying to conserve warmth that was bleeding away into the merciless night with every passing second. The road stretched ahead, and she kept thinking the next hill would show her Wally's lights, that the next turn would bring his driveway into view. But each hill climbed only revealed more darkness, more road, more cold that was beginning to feel less like discomfort and more like something alive and hungry, eating its way toward her core. Her thoughts began to slow down, becoming thick and heavy like syrup in winter. She stopped feeling her feet, which should have frightened her, but instead just seemed like a distant fact, something happening to someone else. The frustration that had driven her forward began to fade into a strange kind of peace, a quiet that settled over her mind like snow. She knew she should be more worried, should be fighting harder, but the cold was doing something to her ability to care, to feel urgency, to hold on to the thread of survival that was slipping through her mental fingers. When she finally saw lights through the trees ahead, a flicker of orange warmth in all that frozen darkness, something in her chest lifted with hope. Wally's house. She'd made it. Just a few more steps, just a little bit farther, and she could knock on that door and find warmth and safety and an end to this terrible cold dot. But her body had other plans. 15 feet from the porch, so close, she could see the individual boards, could make out the shape of the door handle. Her legs simply stopped working. There was no dramatic fall, no struggle or fight. Her knees folded under her, and she went down onto the frozen ground as if she'd decided to lie down for a rest. She tried to crawl, her hands and knees pushing against snow that felt no colder than the rest of her, moving forward with a determination that was more instinct than thought. 5 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet. Her body was shutting down, room by room, turning off lights and closing doors as the cold invaded every cell. At some point, she stopped crawling. At some point, the last of her warmth fled into the frozen air. And Jean Hilliard, 19 years old, lay down in the snow 15 feet from salvation and felt the darkness she'd been walking through finally rise up and swallow her whole. The cold didn't hurt anymore. That was the strangest thing. The mercy hidden in the horror. As her body temperature dropped toward incompatibility with life, the pain receptors stopped firing. The nerves stopped sending their desperate signals. Her heart, that faithful muscle that had beaten every second of her 19 years without pause, began to slow, each beat taking longer, the pauses between them stretching out like the spaces between stars. Her blood thickened and crawled through vessels that were collapsing, her organs entering a state that looked so much like death that no observer could have seen the difference. The moisture in her eyes froze solid, and her eyelids locked open in a stare that saw only darkness. Her skin turned gray, then white, taking on the color and texture of frozen meat pulled from a freezer. And there, in Wally Nelson's front yard, while he slept unaware inside his heated house, Jean Hilliard's body became less a living organism and more an ice sculpture in the rough shape of a young woman who had died reaching for help that came 12 hours too late. But she wasn't dead. Not quite, not yet. In that space between life and death, where medicine has no good answers and faith finds its battleground, something in Jean Hilliard refused to surrender. Those tiny bubbles that Wally saw, those impossible wisps of breath, were the only evidence that some pilot light of life still flickered in the frozen darkness. Her heartbeat, if you could call it, beating 12 times per minute, barely 1/5 the rate of a living human. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, 2 or 3 times each minute, bringing in air so cold it might have done more harm than good. Her brain, starved of oxygen but preserved by the same cold that was killing her, waited in a kind of suspended animation, hovering in the space where consciousness stops but damage hasn't quite begun. It shouldn't have been possible. Every medical text would say it wasn't possible, but there it was, stubborn as prairie grass in spring, that tiny flame of life refusing to go out. When Wally carried her into Foston Hospital, the emergency staff took one look and knew. They were staring at a corpse that somehow still registered a pulse. Dr. George Seth, who had practiced medicine in rural Minnesota for years, and thought he'd seen everything these prairie winters could throw at humanity, stood over Jean's frozen body and felt something close to awe mixed with his horror. Her skin was so hard they couldn't insert an IV needle. The needles bent and broke against her frozen flesh, like they were trying to pierce wood. Her eyes were solid ice, unresponsive to light because there was no living tissue there to respond. Just frozen fluid that had once carried sight. They took her temperature and the thermometer didn't register. Couldn't register because her body temperature had dropped below 80 degrees, past the point where their instruments could measure. The nurses looked at Dr. Sather, and he looked back, and nobody had to say what they were all thinking. This girl was gone, and what they were looking at was the aftermath, the frozen documentation of a life that ended in the snow. But they were healers, and healers don't give up while a heartbeat exists, no matter how faint. They wrapped Jean in heating pads and blankets, cranking the warmth up despite knowing that rapid rewarming of frozen tissue often does more damage than the freezing itself, causes cells to burst and die as the ice crystals inside them melt and expand. They tried repeatedly to get an IV line in, finally succeeding after multiple attempts, pushing fluids into her that her body might or might not be able to use. They worked with quiet efficiency, going through the motions because that's what you do. Because the alternative is to look at a 19-year-old girl and say she's beyond help, which is something no doctor wants to say while breath still moves in a body. Dr. Sather described her to the nurses in words that would haunt the medical report. The body was cold, completely solid, just like a piece of meat, out of a deep freeze. It was a butcher's description, because that's what he was looking at: frozen flesh that looked nothing like a living patient and everything like meat prepared for long-term storage. The morning stretched into hours of waiting, of monitoring vital signs that barely qualified as vital, of watching for any change in a girl who looked like she'd been carved from ice. The hospital staff moved through their routines with heavy hearts, knowing they were likely witnessing the slow documentation of death rather than the beginning of recovery. Jean's family arrived, her mother seeing her daughter's frozen body and making a sound that no parent should have to make. A grief so raw it seemed to physically fill the room. They stood by her bedside, these people who loved her, and felt utterly helpless as the heating pads did their slow work, and the frozen girl in the bed showed no signs of thawing into life. Hope is a strange thing in a hospital, the way it grows and dies and grows again. The way it clings to the smallest signs, even when logic says to let go. And in that hospital room, hope was in short supply, but in the hospital office, something else was happening. A devout nurse named Mrs. Erickson, whose husband was a pastor at the Baptist Church in Folkestone, couldn't shake the feeling that medicine alone wasn't going to be enough for this impossible case. She'd seen the frozen girl, seen the doctor's face, knew the odds were 0 or worse, but she also knew that prayer had power. That faith could reach into places where stethoscopes and thermometers couldn't follow. So she picked up the phone and called the prayer chain chairman at her church. And with those calls, she set in motion something that would ripple through the entire community. "We have a girl here," she told them, "Jean Hilliard from Lengby. She's frozen solid. She's dying. We need prayer." And with those words, the machinery of faith began to turn. The prayer chain spread like fire through dry grass. From the Baptist Church, calls went out to the Lutheran Church, to the Catholic Church, to the Methodist Church, to the Bethel Assembly. Each pastor called their prayer chain chairman, and those chairmen called their networks, and within hours, more than 30 people across Folkestone and beyond were lifting Jean Hilliard's name to heaven. They prayed in their homes, in their churches, in their places of work. They prayed while making breakfast and driving tractors and sitting at their kitchen tables. They prayed with the kind of desperate intensity that comes when death is immediate and certain. When medicine has done all it can and something more is needed. Most of them didn't know Jean Hilliard personally, but in a small community where winter was always waiting to claim the unwary. Her story was everyone's story. Her crisis was everyone's crisis, and so they prayed. 2 hours after the prayer chain began, while those voices were still lifting Jean's name like a collective breath toward God, something changed in that hospital room. Jean's body began to convulse. Not the gentle shivering of warming, this was violent, spastic, full-body convulsions that shook the bed and made the monitors spike and set off alarms that brought nurses running. The frozen girl who had looked more dead than alive, whose body had been rigid as timber just moments before, was suddenly moving with an intensity that suggested something was breaking loose inside her. Some barrier between death and life was cracking like ice in spring. Dr. Sather rushed in, watching in disbelief as Jean's chest began to heave, as her grey skin started to pink up in patches, as her pulse that barely there 12 beats per minute began to climb, 15, 18, 20. "This isn't possible," someone said. But nobody was really listening, because they were all watching the impossible happen right in front of them. Her eyes, those frozen orbs that had stared at nothing, began to move. The ice that had locked them in place started to melt, and beneath it, her pupils responded to light for the first time in hours. Her breathing, which had been those shallow 2 breath per minute gasps, deepened and regularized, pulling in oxygen that her body suddenly seemed able to use. Her fingers twitched, then moved, then bent, flexibility returning to joints that had been locked solid. The heating pads that had seemed like futile gestures were suddenly doing their work. And Jean's body was responding, not just passively, but actively, fighting its way back from the edge of death with a determination that made the medical staff exchange glances that said they were witnessing something beyond their training. "She's coming back," Dr. Sather said, and his voice had wonder in it, the kind of wonder doctors rarely allow themselves because science doesn't have room for wonder, but here it was anyway, unavoidable and overwhelming. By mid, Jean's eyes opened fully and focused. She looked around the room, confusion clear on her face, and tried to speak. Her mother grabbed her hand that had been frozen solid just hours before. Jean squeezed back. "Where am I?" Jean whispered, her voice hoarse, but undeniably alive, undeniably present. "What happened?" The questions came slowly, each one an effort. But they were the right questions, coherent questions that proved her brain was working despite having been starved of oxygen for hours. The nurses started crying, not bothering to hide their tears, because they'd seen her when she came in, and they were seeing her now. And the distance between those two states was a distance that shouldn't have been crossable. Dr. Sather examined her, checking her pupil responses, testing her reflexes, asking her to move her fingers and toes. And with each test that came back normal, his amazement grew. "This is unprecedented," he said to anyone who would listen. "This doesn't happen." By noon, Jean was talking coherently, carrying on conversations. Worried about her father's car in the ditch, and whether she was going to be in trouble for wrecking it. The ordinary concerns of a 19-year-old girl. Mundane worries that were the most beautiful sound anyone in that hospital had heard all day. Her mother held her hand and laughed through tears, thanking God and the doctors in the same breath, knowing that both had played their part in this impossible recovery. Jean told them what she remembered: the drive, the slide into the ditch, the walk through the cold, seeing Wally's house, and then nothing, a blank darkness that held no dreams, no visions, just absence. She didn't remember crawling, didn't remember falling, didn't remember the 6 hours she spent frozen in the snow. That time was simply gone, erased from her memory as if it had happened to someone else. "I thought I'd just sleep for a minute," she said. "And then I'd knock on the door." The innocence of it. The ordinary logic of someone who had no idea she'd been dancing with death, made everyone in the room fall silent. The doctors kept her under close observation, waiting for the inevitable complications to appear. They'd seen enough frostbite cases to know that frozen tissue often dies later, that amputations are sometimes necessary days or weeks after the initial injury. Once the true extent of the damage becomes clear, they expected her legs to turn black, expected her fingers and toes to show signs of gangrene, expected her brain to reveal damage through confusion or memory loss or personality changes, but none of it happened. Her legs stayed pink and healthy, with full sensation returning over the course of days. Her fingers and toes showed no signs of permanent damage, no blackening of tissue that would signal cells dying from the inside. Her mental function tested normal, no confusion, no memory problems beyond the blank hours in the snow. No cognitive deficits that would suggest her brain had been harmed by oxygen deprivation. It was as if her body had been placed in a perfect state of preservation, frozen in a way that protected rather than destroyed. And now that she was thawed, she was simply ... fine. On the third day, Jean moved her legs for the first time since being brought in. The physical therapist had expected months of rehabilitation, expected to have to teach her to walk again, but Jean's legs responded to her commands immediately. Muscles working despite having been frozen solid just days before. She sat up in bed, swung her legs over the side, stood with assistance, and took 3 steps before the nurses made her get back in bed because protocol said she shouldn't be moving yet. But Jean Hilliard had never been one to follow protocol when her body told her otherwise. And her body was telling her loud and clear that she was ready to be done with being an invalid. The doctors consulted with each other, reviewed her charts again and again, looking for some explanation they might have missed, some mechanism that would make this recovery make sense. They found nothing. What they had was a medical miracle without a medical explanation. And Dr. Sather finally admitted to the family what they'd all been thinking. This is beyond our understanding. She should not be alive, and if she is alive, she should not be this functional. Something beyond medicine happened here. 6 days after being frozen solid, Jean Hilliard walked out of Foston Hospital on her own 2 feet. With no walker, no wheelchair, no assistance beyond her mother's steadying hand on her arm. The nurses lined the hallway to watch her go, applauding, crying, bearing witness to something they would tell their grandchildren about decades later. Jean was wearing ordinary clothes, walking at an ordinary pace, looking like any other young woman leaving the hospital after a minor illness. Except that everyone there knew the truth: this was no minor illness, and her walking was no ordinary miracle. The prayer chain that had started with Mrs. Erickson's phone call had continued throughout Jean's hospitalization. And when word went out that she was being discharged, that she was not only alive but completely healed, the churches of Foston rang their bells in celebration, a sound of joy that rolled across the frozen prairie like proof that winter doesn't always win. The story spread beyond Foston, beyond Minnesota, rippling outward through a country hungry for stories of hope and impossible survival. Jean appeared on television, was interviewed by newspapers, became briefly famous as the frozen girl who lived. Tom Brokaw flew her to New York for the Today Show, and she brought her mother along, treating it like an adventure rather than a burden. Still more interested in living her life than in being defined by the worst night of it, she told her story with humility, never claiming to know why she survived when medical science said she shouldn't have. Never preaching or proselytizing, just offering the facts and leaving people to draw their own conclusions. But when asked directly about the prayers, about the faith of her community, she didn't hesitate. "I believe the prayers helped save me. The doctors did their part, but I think something else was at work too, something the doctors couldn't control." Wally Nelson, who found her frozen in his yard, gave his own interviews, describing that terrible moment when he thought his friend was dead. The shock of seeing those bubbles at her nose, the way her body had felt like a frozen log as he slid her into his vehicle. He'd lived in Minnesota his whole life, had seen what winter could do to the unprepared, and he knew without being told that Jean should not have survived. "When I saw her in that hospital bed, awake and talking," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I knew I'd witnessed something special. Call it a miracle, call it divine intervention, call it whatever you want, but something saved that girl that science can't explain." He never took credit for saving her, always deflected praise by saying he just did what anyone would have done. But the truth was that his quick action got her to the hospital while some spark of life still remained, and that timing might have made all the difference. The medical community struggled with how to classify Jean's case. Dr. Sather wrote up the details for medical journals, trying to explain what had happened in terms that would make sense to his peers, but even his scientific language couldn't hide the awe that came through in his descriptions. Dr. David Plummer, an expert in hypothermia at the University of Minnesota, offered the most credible scientific explanation. As Jean's body cooled, her metabolism slowed dramatically, entering a state almost like hibernation, where her cells needed very little oxygen to survive. The extreme cold that should have killed her might have actually protected her vital organs by putting them into suspended animation. If her body warmed at the same rate it had cooled, which the heating pads allowed, then recovery was theoretically possible. But even Dr. Plummer admitted this was a best-case scenario that almost never happens. That required perfect timing and perfect conditions, and, yes, probably a good measure of luck or grace or whatever word you wanted to use for factors beyond our understanding. Years later, Jean would marry and have 3 children. Living a normal life in Cambridge, Minnesota, working and raising her family with no lingering effects from that frozen night. The only permanent change was psychological. She wouldn't drive on icy rural roads after dark anymore, and who could blame her? But physically, mentally, emotionally, she was fine. Which doctors still struggled to explain decades after the fact. She never claimed to be special, never suggested she was chosen or saved for some grand purpose. Instead, she lived quietly, telling her story when asked, but not dwelling on it. Treating her impossible survival as a gift to be used through living well, rather than a burden to carry or a platform to preach from. And perhaps that was the most remarkable thing about Jean Hilliard, not that she survived, but that she survived and remained fundamentally unchanged, humble, grateful, and gracious. The prayer chains that formed that morning in Foston became part of the story's legend, a tangible expression of community faith that could be traced and verified. Mrs. Erickson kept records who she called, when she called them, how the chain spread from church to church across denominational lines that usually stayed firmly in place. The timeline was undeniable. Prayer chain started, and 2 hours later, Jean's body responded with those violent convulsions that marked the beginning of her recovery. Correlation doesn't prove causation, skeptics said. And they were right, it doesn't. But for the people who prayed, For the families in those churches who saw their collective petition answered in such a dramatic and immediate way, the connection felt less like correlation and more like response. They had asked for a miracle, and a miracle had arrived. And whether you believed that was divine intervention or simply fortunate timing, the fact remained that something extraordinary had happened in that window of prayer. In the decades since, medical science has learned more about hypothermia, about the ways extreme cold can sometimes preserve life in cases where warmth would allow death. New protocols for treating frozen patients emerged. Better understanding of rewarming techniques. Appreciation for how the human body can survive in states that seem incompatible with life. Jean Hilliard's case became a teaching tool, a reference point for emergency medicine specialists dealing with extreme cold injuries. But even with better understanding, even with decades of additional research and similar cases to study, doctors still shake their heads when discussing Jean's recovery. The completeness of it, the speed of it, the lack of any permanent damage, those elements still don't fit neatly into scientific understanding. Something else was at work. Whether you call it grace or chance, or the mystery of human resilience that science hasn't fully mapped. What remains, beyond the medical reports and newspaper clippings, beyond the television interviews and the legend that grew around the story, is a young woman who fell in the snow and should have died but didn't. A community that prayed and saw their prayers answered in real time. A doctor who witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about what bodies could endure. And in all of it, threaded through every moment like a golden strand, the persistent question that has no easy answer. Why did Jean Hilliard survive? Was it the speed of her rescue, the skill of her doctors, the prayers of her community, the resilience of her young body, the perfect storm of circumstances that aligned in her favor? Or was it something else entirely, some grace that cannot be measured or predicted, that touches one life and not another for reasons we cannot begin to fathom? The answer, perhaps, is yes to all of it. Yes to the medicine, and yes to the prayers. Yes to the science, and yes to the faith. Yes to the luck, and yes to the grace. Because maybe the miracle isn't that we have to choose between them, but that they can work together. That the natural and supernatural aren't always separate categories, but sometimes overlap in ways that leave us standing in awe. Jean Hilliard's survival doesn't prove anything about God, or prayer, or the nature of miracles. It's a single story. One data point, and you can interpret it through whatever lens you bring to it. But what it does prove, beyond any doubt, is that the human body and spirit can endure and survive, and even thrive after circumstances that should, by all rights, end in death, and in a world that often feels cold and unforgiving. That truth alone is worth holding on to. The hospitals still have heating pads and thermometers. The roads are still icy in winter, and people still slide into ditches on frozen nights in rural Minnesota. But they also have Jean Hilliard's story now. A reminder that sometimes the impossible happens, that sometimes the frozen thaw back to life, that sometimes the prayers of ordinary people in ordinary churches reach through whatever barrier separates petition from answer and bring back someone everyone thought was lost. It's a story without an ending, really, because Jean is still alive, still living out the gift of that impossible recovery. Still carrying forward the mystery of why she survived when so many others in similar circumstances have not. And maybe that's the right way for such stories to exist, not tied up with neat explanations, but left open, held gently, examined with humility, and allowed to mean whatever they need to mean for each person who hears them, and wonders that this account is based on real events documented extensively by Minnesota Public Radio in January 2018, and reported by numerous other outlets including IFL Science, the Epoch Times, and the Unsolved Mysteries television program. Jean Hilliard's survival on December 20, 1980. After being frozen for approximately 6 hours in -22-degree temperatures near Langby, Minnesota, remains one of the most remarkable cases of extreme hypothermia survival in medical literature. The prayer chain organized across multiple churches in Boston, documented by hospital staff and community members, involved more than 30 people and began just hours before Jean's dramatic recovery. Dr. George Sather of Foston Hospital, along with emergency medicine expert Dr. David Plummer of the University of Minnesota, confirmed the medical details of her case, which continues to be studied and referenced in hypothermia treatment protocols. Jean Hilliard Vig lives today in Cambridge, Minnesota, and has spoken publicly about her experience numerous times over the years, consistently acknowledging both the medical care she received and the power of community prayer in her miraculous recovery.